Welcome to the Trustbound podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first episode of the Trustbound podcast. So if you listen to the intro, you already know this podcast exists because something shifted in how growth and momentum work in this day and age. So what I want to do in this episode is slow that down a bit. I don't want to explain it like a framework, but rather I want to talk through how it showed up for me across different roles over time. Because Trustbound didn't start as an idea. It started as a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. I guess I was already living it. I just only needed to give it a name. You know, I've been lucky enough to see growth from a lot of angles. I've been the person carrying quota, not just personally, but also team-wise. I've been the person building teams and processes. I've been the advisor sitting in rooms after things didn't work. And I've also been on the investor side, deciding where conviction actually lives. And here's the part that kept repeating no matter the role. And it's that the moments that really moved things forward almost never started cold, but rather they started with context, with someone saying, hey, you should talk to this person, or asking, hey, can you intro me to this person at this company? You know, things started with a relationship that already had some memory in it. Sometimes it's quite curious. I noticed this in real time, but most of the time I didn't until much, much, much later. You know, early in my career, I did all the right things. I did outbound, sequences before they were cool and mainstream, follow-ups, built processes, segmented, my territory, my teams, my database, specialized in the role. And yes, deals came from building those processes and respecting those processes and level of execution. But curiously enough, the deals that move faster, the ones that felt lighter, the ones where trust didn't need to be manufactured, those almost always had a human being in the middle. They almost always had a human bridge in the middle, bridging point A to point B, human A to human B. You're bridging me to whoever I wanted to talk to. And these people, they change. Sometimes it was a former colleague, sometimes it was a shared investor, sometimes it was a current colleague, sometimes it was a customer, customer who said, hey, I've had such a great experience with Mauricio that you should meet him. And sometimes it was even people inside the same organization working for you, bridging for you, being that bridger. And what struck me wasn't that these deals closed, but rather it was how little to none convincing or selling they needed, because I was rather helping them buy and understand if what I was offering could be the best fit for the project they had and the problem they were looking to solve. And later when I moved up the ranks and, I started leading teams, of course, I never stopped selling. But when I started leading teams as my core function, I saw the same thing play out at scale. My top performers weren't just good at selling, but rather they were also great at staying present. They remembered people. They stayed in touch without asking for something with not just their customers, but with their prospects, even prospects that went with the competition, because the experience, they showed up in ways that felt incredibly natural and not transactional. And when opportunity finally appeared, they weren't introducing themselves. They were just continuing the conversation that already existed because that trust existed with that person that generated that spark and that introduction. And then I started advising and mentoring startups, uh, different from a role of an operator. And as an advisor and mentor, something else became clear. Founders didn't reach out to me because I had the perfect answer, but rather they reached out to me because someone they trusted told them to. Often I didn't even know I'd been pitched internally in those conversations beforehand. Uh, Trust had already done the work for me. A great example of that is my great friend Andres Cano. He's always putting up a great word for me when I'm not in those rooms. Andres, for context, he is the general partner of Pigma. It's a fund I'm part of. And like I said, he's always putting up a great word for me. And it's just one of the ways how you show up for someone when a relationship matters. And only, it's not that it's only one way. I actually sent Andres an intro and talked him up in my conversation a couple of days ago in a call that I had with Tom, a gentleman that recently, became a Stage 2 Capital Limited partner. And Stage 2 is a fund where, I'm part of, I'm also an LP, and I'm also very active. So by the time I speak with folks that get referred to me, the question necessarily isn't who are you, but rather how do we think about this together and how can I help? It's very, very curious because that's a very, very different starting point, and trust is already implicit. It's very hard to put into words. It's just a feeling that you get when you join the call. And on the investing side, the pattern gets even sharper. Cold decks are everywhere and pitches are everywhere, but warm conviction is very rare. The investments I felt strongest about almost always came through either a founder I already respected or a referral from someone whose judgment I really trusted, or also a relationship where belief and trust had time to compound. Because it works better than the stock market when you think about trust. And speaking of relationships and the investing side of things, trust didn't necessarily replace diligence, but rather it focused it. Because, as an angel investor, I get pinged all the time, to meet founders and invest in founders. But when trust does the work for me, it just it focuses my time and my energy. And an example of this would be both Peel and Dreamwriter. I met Brannon, Peel's co-founder and CEO, when they were raising their pre-seed. After a couple of calls with Brannon, I invested in them. And months later, Brannon introduced me to his friend Evan, who is Dreamwriter's co-founder and CEO. Evan at the time was also looking for funding. He was also looking for angel investors, and he was also in pre-seed, in the pre-seed stage. So after a couple of calls, not just because Evan was so great and Dreamwriter was so compelling, but because of that relationship that I had with Brannon, and Brannon was connected to Evan, I ended up investing in Evan and the Dreamwriter team as well. You know, Not only that, but I've referred them business and even referred a longtime high school friend who, in fact, is actually the cousin of one of my best friends from high school to Peel. And they ended up, working together, not on the investment side of things, but rather on the contracting and employment side of things. And, I've, of course, referred Evan a bunch of business and even invited him to Pigma, where the fund that I'm part of, for him to get to know the startups there. So at some point where I'm getting here is that things stopped feeling like coincidence. Across roles, stages, industries, the same dynamic kept showing up. And it's that trust and respect wasn't a nice to have, but rather it was the catalyst. On the same note, on the same note, the lack of trust and respect is the constraint. So, and what makes this harder over time is that context decays. If you don't protect it, relationships cool, familiarity fades, and people unfortunately turn into names in a CRM. That's when growth and momentum start to feel heavy and difficult. Not because you forgot how to sell, but because you're constantly restarting from zero, similar like a pipeline. So that's what I mean by Trustbound. Trustbound is a way of going to market where growth is pulled forward by relationships that already carry belief, trust, timing, and context. It's not about necessarily asking for favors. It's not about spamming your network. It's about earning the right to show up early so that when the timing and the moment is right, the conversation just feels obvious. Because, I feel that sales or selling for that matter is a mix of three things. Number one, fit. Number two, timing. But most importantly, number three, trust. Trustbound happens before opportunity exists. If you're a founder selling your first product, you feel this immediately. Outbound feels exhausting. Inbound feels slow, and you don't have time to wait. Trustbound gives you leverage without burning bridges. If you're leading a revenue or partnerships team at scale, though, you feel it differently. Depending on the use case, Trustbound is spelled completely differently. If you're in the second type of seat, if you will, you have emotion, you have motion, but it's hard to coordinate. Co-selling looks very good on slides, but very messy in practice. Trustbound gives you a way to align people before deals need to happen. They're different stages, but it's the same underlying force. As I said previously, this podcast isn't here to teach you a playbook. It's here to give you language to something you've probably already lived or are living, but just don't know how to put a name to it. Every conversation we'll have is about one thing: how trust actually moves work forward and what happens when we stop treating it like a soft skill. In the next episode, I'll be joined by the one and only Tomas Uribe, co-founder and CEO of Mavity. We're going to talk about how we met, how we started working together, and why that story has nothing to do with a pitch deck or with sales or with selling, and why it has everything to do with timing, context, and of course, most importantly, trust, which is honestly one of the, if not the most trust-bound story I know. If this resonates, I'd love to hear your stories too. The moments where someone vouched for you, the moment where an intro changed everything. The moments where trust and respect moved faster than any process ever could. Because in business, like in life, trust and respect either make you or break you.
If this resonated, pay attention to where trust has already been doing the work for you. That's where momentum starts. Learn more at itogai.com. See you next time. I'm Mauricio Suarez, and this is the Trustbound Podcast.